And welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. Thanks a lot for tuning in today, broadcasting from my home studio, better known as the kitchen table. Looking forward to today's discussion. Listen, I've got a whole bunch of questions for today's guests, but if you have any questions on what's going on with Canada's plant protein processing sector, as it applies to some of the things that are going on at Protein Industries Canada, you can be sure to ask them, whether you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or Twitch. 4 different ways. Or some of you are probably at realagriculture.com/live as well. Okay, so yeah, let's get to today's guest. Let's not waste any more time. Let's bring him in, and it is the CEO of Protein Industries Canada, is Bill Greuel. Hey, Bill, how are you?
I'm well, Shaun. How are you doing today?
Hey, man, I'm doing pretty fantastic. Looking forward to today's discussion. So, Bill, what's interesting is when you post something on LinkedIn, you get some likes and you get some comments, and sometimes it turns into a live streaming conversation. You posted your speech of your presentation you gave to the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food last week. What was the main message you wanted to leave them with last week?
Yeah, so first off, it's really good to see the Government of Canada taking an interest in the agriculture sector. And so I wanted to leave them with a couple of things. One is the strength of the sector. It's a great industry and is poised to be a driver of economic recovery in the post-COVID era. And then really to leave them with the impression of what it is we need to do to achieve our potential. And that's really around regulatory modernization, good innovation policy, strong investment, and really important in terms of the work of the federal government around market access.
And what were some of the questions that the MPs dropped your way based on that messaging?
Yeah, I thought the questions were actually pretty interesting, Shaun, because it demonstrates a bit of the work we have to do to make sure everybody understands the scope and scale of the agriculture sector here in Western Canada. Some of the questions were around interprovincial trade barriers, which probably isn't a huge issue for the plant protein sector, but obviously on the minds of MPs. Some of the questions were related to the issues and challenges that we're facing from an export market opportunity. But interesting, a lot of the questions were for my counterpart that was talking about micro abattoirs in Quebec, and really a lot of interest from the MPs about the local food movement, which I think is important for Canada, but it also demonstrates our need to really talk about large-scale production agriculture with our MPs.
Yeah. Now, I had this in my notes. You brought it up already. Was where agriculture fits in from an economic standpoint, and I've had numerous economists on here talking about how clearly agriculture fits into the upper part of that K-type recovery, if that's the kind of recovery that we believe in. You've mentioned how important agriculture is, but we still have some gaps in trying, I think, sometimes to get across that goal line to get political parties, all stripes, to really for that to sink in, right?
Yeah, I agree. And so if you just think about agriculture and food as a sector today, it's actually the largest employer in Canada. 2.3 million Canadians employed in agriculture and food. That includes the food service industry as well. And the second largest contributor to GDP. And so if anybody thinks that this isn't an engine of economic growth for the country, they really need to dig a little bit and see. I think some of the challenges really are around the perception of agriculture. We're all, not all of us, but many Canadians are a couple generations removed from the farm, and so they still have this idea that it's hip roof barns and pitchforks is farming, right? It's a very different industry, and we got to do better at making sure that decision makers understand this is a growth industry. It's a high tech industry. Digitization, things that are happening in the agriculture sector. It's not unlike what's happening in med tech and fintech. Like we're a highly sophisticated industry, and we got to do a better job of telling that story.
Yeah, Kara sort of feeds off what you just said. So, a lot of people come on this show and say this. You've said it. You
Yeah.
communicate it, you champion this message all the time. I've heard you in numerous speeches talk about it. How do we really, really cross the finish line on it and get them to implement policy that sort of drives that forward? And maybe, you know what, maybe Protein Industries Canada is an example of getting it. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
Well, I think actually that's true, right? So this is the first time that the federal government has really stood up and said agriculture is a true driver. And so to Kara's point, maybe government has listened. $153 million investment into Protein Industries Canada, really aimed at growing the agriculture sector, I think is recognition. So the work that we're doing as a sector to make that case in Ottawa is being listened to. I think one of the other things we have to do though is really hone in on making the case a little bit better and stronger. So we talk about, the Barton report and the work of the economic strategy table came out and said, we can become the fifth largest food economy in the world. We can grow, export sales to 140 billion. But to show some tangible steps toward that, I think is really critical and really important. And I would venture to say that some of the investments that we're making at Protein Industries Canada is going to start showing that the investment will lead to economic growth for the country.
Yeah, I saw you mentioned the Barton report in your speech to the standing committee. Um, Barton report is something that gets thrown out a lot, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
People are, the Barton report, the Barton report. Are we doing our best to really put it into action? We keep on throwing it out there. There's a lot of verbal stuff that goes with it. But are we putting it into, or is the rubber meeting the road? I guess that's maybe the best way to ask it.
Yeah, I would say in some respects yes, in some respects no. And so I think what are the good outcomes that the Barton report had? I think it for the first time really lends some credibility to agriculture as a growth industry for the country. I don't think you end up with an innovation supercluster in the agriculture and food space without it. So and the investment that the government of Canada has made of 153 million into PIC is part of that. But there's other things in there that we're not executing on. We're not executing on regulatory modernization in the agriculture and food space in this country. We need a lot of capital to flow into the agriculture sector. Now, that's not always government's role, right? Industry has to do that. So there are some things that we're not executing on that were highlighted in the Barton report. The main one I would say is we just don't have enough movement on regulatory modernization in this country yet.
Yeah, I hear that from a lot of sections of agriculture,
Yeah.
for sure. Now, Protein Industries Canada. Well, I won't answer it for you. For those that aren't aware, what is the objective of the Protein
Mhm.
Industries Canada supercluster?
Yeah, I think top line objectives is to grow the value added processing sector in Western Canada. So we're sitting on 70 million acres of land. We produce on average 60 million metric tons of crop production on an annual basis here in Western Canada. The vast majority of that is being shipped out of the country as whole seed. There's billions of dollars of value locked up in that seed. And so our objective is to grow value-added processing so that we're no longer shipping raw commodities, but we're shipping high-value ingredients and eventually someday maybe consumer packaged goods and food products.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, but I get these emails from some of the audience, and the response I get when we talk about this is, okay, but we're really good at shipping. Our whole system is set up to actually export those raw commodities. We're good at it. We've
Mhm.
got the grain elevator system from a grain perspective. We've got the railways. We've invested in some of our ports. There's obviously some bottlenecks there, but we've built
Mhm.
this capacity. Why are we moving away from that by building domestic processing?
Yeah, so maybe a couple things. One is crop production is steadily increasing in Western Canada, right? Every year, we're producing more. I think Saskatchewan. I just heard the numbers today. Second largest crop on record from 2020, 39.1 million metric tons. So let's say that we start value added processing. You know, if you look at climate change models and the rate of growth in terms of just primary production, we're still going to need the rail lines, we're still going to need the elevators, we're still going to need the ports because we keep producing more. And so let's not worry about the fact that we're going to have stranded infrastructure because we're processing so much at home. Likely not the case. I think the second reason, though, why it's so important is this is really what's going to help insulate us from trade disruptions, right? Like, we know what happened with canola sales in China. We know what happened with our sale of pulses to India. You know, those are non-tariff trade barriers. Those are geopolitical forces that mean we're at a lot of risk in shipping commodity agriculture. If we're shipping branded products, if we're shipping high value ingredients, if we're shipping products that everybody wants and needs around the world, it's a lot harder for the actions of governments in other nations to slow down or put on non-tariff or tariff trade barriers on those products than it is on commodities.
So tied to this, in your discussion with the Standing Ag Committee, you mentioned that we're lagging in science and innovation. Explain that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you take a look at what nations comparable to Canada would invest in science and innovation across all sectors of the economy. So we can dig into the agriculture numbers a bit if you want, but this is true for Canada compared to the average of OECD nations in the world in terms of our investment in science and innovation across both levels of government, across academia, and across the private sector. We're about half of the OECD average in terms of our investment in science and innovation. And so you look at some of the most innovative economies around the world, Korea, some nations in Northern Europe, Israel, they're investing 2x based on GDP, what we are in Canada. And so we would have to double our investment in science and innovation across all three sectors, private sector, public sector, and academic institutions to keep up with OECD averages. And we know that innovation and investment in science and innovation is a key driver, especially for sectors like agriculture that's science intensive.
Okay, so you're responsible to delve out some dollars to fund an increased amount of research and build that innovation portfolio. Where do the funds come from then? If we are going to drive research and science forward, are we as Canadians, are we expecting that to come from the private side, or what do those partnerships look like?
Yeah, well, I think long term, Sean, it has to come from the private side because investments in science and innovation and research have to have commercial application at the end of the day. They lead to value, they lead to GDP, and they lead to job growth. And it's really only the private sector that can do that. But when you have our economy in Canada that's behind, like we are in terms of science and innovation, part of what we're trying to do, part of what the Innovation Supercluster Initiative is trying to do, is de-risk those initial science and innovation investments in the agriculture sector and help, I think, leapfrog forward the sector in terms of the outcomes of research and hopefully in the theory behind the Innovation Supercluster Initiative and what we're doing is to really kickstart those investments in science and innovation so that the private sector comes on and makes follow-on investments. This can't be government making investments for the long term. We really want to de-risk and make sure that there's space for the private sector to come in.
Yeah, and I know from some of our previous conversations, one of the components of these funding announcements that you've made that you're really kind of you think is cool is the fact connecting stakeholders or companies that actually wouldn't necessarily collaborate, or they didn't know each other, or they weren't aware of each other as maybe they could have been. You're almost like a bit of a dot connector, not just obviously somebody handing out dollars, but you're connecting dots for people.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we set out to do, and maybe I'm rewriting history and said we were going to do this from the beginning, but we often call it a value chain approach to the investments that we make, and so every Protein Industry Canada investment is a requirement for two companies, a minimum of two companies, one of which must be a small and medium-sized enterprise, and we'll come back to why that's really critical. But the idea of putting at least two companies together in a research project is the idea that 1 + 1 is 3. And I'll just maybe give you an example of that, where, the issues and the problems and the challenges we're trying to solve in the sector are bigger than any one company. And so, we know that investments that we're making in plant breeding. So we launched a large project with Corteva, right? We want to decrease fiber content and increase protein content in canola. Well, that's great, but if we did that and we put that project together with Bunge and Botanico is an innovative processor building technology out of Calgary. And so if you take the breeding company and you put them together with processors who are looking at the different meal that's coming out of the processing because of lower fiber content and higher protein content, you really start to see the benefits of that downstream. And there's a feedback loop that happens between processor and breeder. And so creating that feedback loop and making sure that the products that we're creating, either through processing or breeding, are going to be applicable and utilized by other members of the value chain. That's really where the value in some of the investments we've made.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you another dissenter question, because I get this one as well frequently when we have these discussions, is why do we need an entity like PIC to distribute these funds? If we set up the regulatory environment for private industry to invest, they're going to invest regardless if there's PIC or not. How do you see that? I'm sure you've heard that same commentary from some people.
Yeah, it's a bit of this is going to happen whether we're here to do it or not. And maybe that's true. I think a couple things. One is, there's a sense of urgency here in terms of the world adopting plant protein, right? Like we just got a preliminary study from Ernst & Young back, and we could talk about the volume and the value of the plant protein space, but make no mistake, the investments are going to be made in terms of processing capacity somewhere in the world, and once that capacity is built, it's built. And so I think you need an entity like Protein Industries Canada to move this faster than it would happen on its own, because we can't afford to let processing capacity be built somewhere else. I think the other piece is collaboration is really easy to say and hard to do. And so we have a number of organizations that said, yeah, we want to be a part of Protein Industries Canada. And then we start talking about what true collaborative R&D looks like, having to put money on the table, having to give up and talk about the background intellectual property that you're bringing to a project, having to sign on a dotted line and contribute funds to a research and development project, having to share in the foreground intellectual property that's going to be created. That doesn't happen without time. It doesn't happen without trust. And, we're helping companies get there faster because of the co-investments that we're making. But we've got a lot of projects that are happening now and collaborations that are happening outside of Protein Industry Canada funding. So yeah, it will happen, but I think we're nudging it there a lot faster. And there is a sense of urgency, I think, that we really need to consider.
What are some of the funding projects that you're, like you already mentioned the one with Corteva and Botanical and Bunge, but what are some of the other ones that you think are really kind of like, they're the flagship ones? They're the ones where it's like, well, here's exactly this is what we're trying to achieve is this kind of project.
Yeah, I'd maybe draw on an example in processing, and I'll maybe draw on one in kind of the production agriculture space. And so on a processing one, we're working with a company out of Winnipeg, Merit Functional Foods. And so they're building a processing facility in and around Winnipeg. And they've got unique technology that they in-licensed from a company called Burcon. And they can make protein concentrates and protein isolates out of canola and peas. What's really interesting about that project is that we've put them together with Pichura Seeds, which is a regional seed grower seed company based out of Manitoba, providing the feedstock. So we have, the kind of the input and understanding what's being fed into the production facility and what are the characteristics of the varieties coming in and how does that affect processing speed, capacity, functionality of the ingredients coming out. And on the back end of that project, we've got a consumer packaged goods company out of Winnipeg called The Winning Combination. And they're taking the products that are coming out of the processing research and developing food products based on the functionality, based on the nutritional content. So this whole concept of that's a really great value chain approach to breeding companies and consumer packaged goods. That's a real good example of what we're doing. I think on the production agriculture side, we've got a really interesting project that's based a couple companies out of Calgary. One is called Verge Technologies, and the other is Precision Analytics. So Verge Technologies is the organization that they've got systems built where they can map out the efficiency of the path that equipment drives in a field so that they can have the highest amount of efficiency. That doesn't sound very exciting in and of itself, but there's a sustainability story to be told there. What's happening though is Verge Technology is collecting a ton of information around crop inputs, crop protection products, and that all leads to a sustainability story for us to tell in Western Canada about the inputs that we're using to produce crops. So part of the next piece of that project is Precision Analytics. So they're a data company, and they're really focused on utilizing the information gained and gathered by the Verge part of the project to figure out what is the carbon footprint and the environmental footprint of the crops that we're producing. And then they're building out a blockchain and traceability system on the back end so that we can trace the crop from field to fork, but at the same time provide all of the data and information that will lead to a sustainability measure of that crop. And so there's an example of a project that any one company couldn't do on their own.
Do you say no to a lot of people, Bill?
Yeah, so we've got 25 active projects in the hopper, but we've had over 80 consortia come to us with concepts and ideas. So we have
what's
to
the
say
usual?
no a lot.
Okay. So, and what's the reason for the no? It just doesn't. It doesn't fit the criteria. Like, what's usually the
Yeah.
typical reason?
It probably fits in a few different buckets. One is, when we came out with our initial call for proposals, people were kicking the tires. What is Protein Industries Canada going to fund? And so it was everything from insect protein and stuff outside of our mandate. So it wasn't aligned with our mandate. I think the two other biggest reasons would be kind of the scope and scale. We're really looking for projects that can hopefully transform the industry. And there's a lot of projects out there that are phenomenal science and great, but the impact just isn't big enough, or we think that they're focused in the wrong areas.
So, how do you judge success? Like, when obviously increasing domestic processing capacity, we can use some quantitative analysis there. But when you say transform the industry, how do I know if we did that or not? How are you benchmarking success?
Yeah, so I think there's the 5-year time frame. We've got a time-bound time horizon here, right? So that's a bit of output measurement, and then there's the longer term measurements. And so I think in the short term, we're really looking for, we want to see companies collaborating and acting differently. We often talk about how, sure, we're funding science and innovation, but we're actually trying to change behaviors. We're trying to have organizations and companies collaborate more, work with public institutions better. And so there's a measure around collaboration. And what we've seen, Shaun, from the very first project that we funded to the one that we're going to announce tomorrow, is the number of companies collaborating in a research and development project has climbed steadily over the course of, tomorrow will be our 14th project announcement. So, we're really seeing that collaboration increase over time. And so I think that's a measure of success for us in the short term. I think another measure for success in the short term will be who are members of Protein Industries Canada, and are we attracting the best and brightest companies to be members of our ecosystem. And so, we've got a lot of work to do there, because we really want to get better connected to the large global consumer brands, the Unilevers, the Nestle's. So I think that will be a measure of success if they look and say, hey, there's some things going on in Western Canada and we got to be a part of it. I think the long-term measures is job growth, its contribution to GDP, and its increased processing capacity here in Western Canada. Now, whether or not we're going to be able to point to that in an initial 5-year mandate, will be hard to do, but I think that's the ultimate measure of success is the increase in processing capacity in Western Canada.
Yeah, good. I was also wanted to ask you about obviously intellectual property is a
Mm-hmm,
huge component of anybody developing technology and they're innovating. How
mm-hmm.
is that handled? Is that kind of between the stakeholders, or does PIC hold on to any of that for future revenue mechanism for funding? Like, how does
Mm-hmm.
that work?
Yeah, so the short answer is we do not hold on to any intellectual property because we felt that as a not for profit entity, that's not going to be our focus in the long term. And I came out of government, right? I've worked in private sector, I've worked in government, I've worked a lot with universities. I've seen it time and time again where government academic institutions, not so much in the not-for-profit corporation, but private sector companies are the best at commercializing intellectual property. And academic institutions want to say that they're good at it, they're not. Government wants to think they're good at it, they're not. And so we were very conscientious about not taking a stake in intellectual property and leaving that in the hands of the companies that created it.
There was a story a couple of months ago, Bill. The Parliamentary Budget Office, the PBO, was critical of some of these superclusters, not just Protein Industries Canada, but all the
Yep.
superclusters, that they were behind in their funding rollouts and would not get to this goal of creating 10,000 jobs. You were quoted in that Globe and Mail story. Do you feel that was really inaccurate, or they kind of didn't necessarily look at timelines appropriately? What were your thoughts on that criticism on a mainstream scope?
Yeah. It was a little bit frustrating, to be honest, Sean, because the Parliamentary Budget Office pulled data about supercluster investments on March 6th, 2020. And they issued their report in October, like 7 months later.
Oh,
Never asked us, uh, the gains that we made between March and October when they issued their report. And so, if you think about what we're trying to do here, um, you know, the speed at which we're moving. So tomorrow's our 14th project announcement. We've got 17 projects approved. We're approving projects at the rate of one or two a month, right? And so you know what? The PBO, if they'd have pulled the data on March 6th and issued it on March 7th, I would have said, yeah, that's accurate. That's actually where we're at today. They weren't wrong. It's just that they didn't look at the entirety of the work that we had done in the intervening time frame. So I think it was unfortunate. I wish they'd given us a call. They never called any of the innovation superclusters to ask how we're doing, right?
hmm. Yeah. Well, and so now you feel you're on track. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
look at where you're at, you're meeting your objectives on your timelines. Because how much time do you have left to roll out the rest of the funding?
Yeah, we're in the back half of year 2 of 5, right? So we're
Okay.
halfway through our mandate today. So tomorrow we'll make a project announcement. We've committed $111 million, and we're on track by the end of the fiscal to be fully committed on our technology budget. And I think the most exciting part is that we've leveraged a significant amount of industry dollars. So our 111 million has leveraged almost another 220 some, right?
Oh
So
wow.
industry's really stepped up to the table in terms of the investments that they're making.
Do you get inquiries from other countries saying how do you guys do this? What is this? What are you up to here?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because the concept of an innovation supercluster is not new. They're all over the place, but the concept of a national government making an investment like they're doing here in Canada through the Innovation Supercluster Initiative is truly unique globally. And so we've had a number of conversations with other innovation clusters around the world, most of which are really trying to broker ideas and concepts and collaboration, but they don't have the investments to be made. Now, what's interesting though is I think other nations are really taking notice of what we're doing here in Canada. And so I think it was earlier this week, the French government announced a significant investment in the development of the plant protein market in France. About 2 weeks ago, I did a consultation for the UK government that's developing a new national food policy for their country. The number one recommendation out of that consultation process came that the UK government has to invest in and support alternative and plant-based protein investments. And so I think, when I talked about the sense of urgency around processing capacity, there's other nations and other national governments that are looking to make significant investments in the development of plant and alternative proteins.
Well, while you're helping the UK government, can you help them with Brexit negotiations with the EU? They're running out of time, Bill. They need some help.
Yeah. I think I'll stick to food policy. That's enough of a stretch for me already.
But your comment about the timeline, like there's only so much capacity that's going to get built, and with Canada being one of the leaders in the production of these crops, I guess if you really sit back and think about it, it would be very regrettable if 2 decades from now we looked back and we said, well, we kind of waited for the industry to come to us, because why wouldn't they come? Why wouldn't processing come to us? Because we have all the production, but it doesn't necessarily always work that way. This is trying to force the matter. Is that the simplest way to kind of describe that?
Yeah, it could be trying to force it, but it's also about really getting good at defining what the opportunity is and what the barriers are. So why hasn't the processing capacity been created in Canada? Why, I did an interview the other day, and it dawned on me as I was talking that, nobody's sitting on the other side of the world eating a handful of dried Canadian peas, right? Somebody on the other side of the world is putting those Canadian peas through a processing facility. So what's held us back in Canada from that? It's capital investment. It's the regulatory environment. I think the thing that I've learned in 2 years in this job is that there's no silver bullet. There is no, if we just did this, we would have processing capacity built. Hey, there's a lot of things that we got to get right. And I think it starts with making the case for private sector investment in Western Canada. Like when we talk about, if we want to process another 20% of our crop production in Western Canada, Shaun, that the capital requirement is measured in the tens of billions of dollars. This is not we need a couple of venture capital funds to come here and spur this on. We need billions of dollars of investment. So to make that case for why it should be here is pretty critical and pretty important.
Yeah, we're having a lot of conversations about domestic processing capacity, especially when it comes to animal proteins due to COVID as well. Maybe that's an example to use, is that, we have a lot of meat production in the country, but all the processing isn't here. Cattle being an example, where that raw commodity is shipped across the standing animal is shipped across the line to the U.S. That's where the capacity is. And that's where the slaughter happens. I mean, that's an example to use to justify what we're trying to do on the plant protein side.
Yep. Yeah, it is. And like I say, the processing capacity is going to be built in the next, there's a decade, right? If you look at the trajectory and the growth of the plant protein market, and the study that we just got back from Ernst & Young, the preliminary analysis is the alternative meat market that the products that we can produce in Western Canada will service into is going to be anywhere between an $85 to $130 billion industry. So you can rest assured that that processing capacity is going to be built somewhere in the world. And this is really our opportunity in Canada to make sure it's here.
Cool stuff. Hey, Bill, I really appreciate you joining us here today. It's been a lot of fun. Keep up the great work, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again and have more of a deeper discussion on this. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Shaun.
Okay, I want to thank everybody today for tuning in to RealAg Live. Tomorrow we've got Denise Hockaday from Climate Fieldview. Wednesday, we've got Tim Caulfield here about his new book called Relax Damn It. I love when you get to say that kind of stuff. He is going to be on the show here today to talk about that new book. Looking forward to it. I'm about halfway through it, and hopefully we'll have it completed by Wednesday. Today on RealAg Radio, 4:30 Eastern on Rural Radio 147. It is going to be Agronomic Monday. Peter W.P. Johnson will be with me to talk all things agronomy across the country, including soil health, which is World Soil Health Day was on Saturday. So we're going to talk a lot about soil health today. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live, and we'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.